Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Scott Parker, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our conversation about re-engineering more efficient and fair labor markets. So to introduce myself, I'm an advisor to the ILO's Global Business Disability Network, where we're looking long and hard at how we bring more disabled people into the labor market with the skills that employers are looking for, so it becomes easier to recruit people with disabilities precisely because they have the skills employers are looking for. I'm also an ambassador to the Zero Project, and it's in that capacity that I've helped to bring this group of individuals together who run an extraordinary set of organizations having a huge impact on the employment prospects of people with disabilities. So if I could tell you something about my guests before we begin. I reckon we've got some 455,000 unique users across these three organizations in the past year. Certainly the kind of vacancies that they report to me, 13,000 job opportunities from Gabriel's organization, 1,200 companies in the last year accessing myAbility to bring talent on board. And all of them are quite unusual, I think, in one, well, they're making a profit. So we need to talk about how you make a profit while enabling the life chances of people with disabilities. But they're also very clear that being a job board is not enough. And so that's a theme I really want us to explore today, because of course, I fear the temptation to just drop job boards into labor markets for disabled people and say, well, that's done, is something we need to be concerned with. So I'd like to start by introducing Guy Braga. Guy from Egalite. And Guy is going to tell us a little bit about his organization. But actually, my real focus for this conversation would start with, Guy, who's your most important customer? Is it the employer or people with disabilities?
Hello, Susan. Thank you for the opportunity to be here at the Zero Conference 2022. It's a pleasure to be also with Gabriel and Wolfgang. We've been really doing a great work with this alliance and sharing all the experience. Susan, that's a great question. At Egalite, we see both as customers. We never charge anything from persons with disabilities. This is our social part, but companies pay for our services. And we see that it's very important to provide all the support in this connection between these two worlds. Here in Brazil, we have a quota law that requires companies to hire persons with disabilities if you have 100 employees or more. And we provide a lot of services to help companies to understand how this process works. Because as you mentioned, it's not just about providing a database of persons with disabilities, because that is not enough to provide support for real inclusion. We think that inclusion is different than hiring a person with disability.
So we talk about how you have a different set of supports for the job seeker, what we would call the kind of push supports that help them to prepare for approaching the world of work in general, and the services that help an employer to actually attract the right candidate to fill a particular vacancies, to pull them in. What kind of services do you offer the employer, and how many employers do you work with?
We've worked here in Brazil with more than 800 companies for the past 10 years that we exist. And the main services that we provide is focused on building an inclusive culture. A lot of companies come to us saying that they cannot fill the legal quota because they cannot find persons with disabilities, but that's not true. The biggest problem are the barriers inside the company, inside of their culture, that they don't even know they exist. So basically, we help them to understand the process and shift their culture to become more inclusive. And as you mentioned, to pull candidates for these job opportunities. So this means being flexible. This means understanding a person with disability, not looking what they cannot do, but their potential. And our recruiting technology that support this is also focused on showing the potential of the candidates. A lot of companies come to us and say, oh, it's not possible to hire a person with disability for this job opportunity. And in our vision, it's possible in all of them, but you'll need to adapt. You'll need to shift the way you're doing. And hiring a person with disability and changing your culture is a big opportunity to find opportunities to improve the whole process of employment, of how you do things.
So your business model is based on the employer paying for this. Why would an employer pay you? In many countries, of course, the assumption is that all the services are free for disabled people.
This is something that is also common here in Brazil, to have NGOs or maybe the government doing this. And we decided to be a for-profit company because it would help us make a statement on what we believe, that inclusion generates value for the company. And we have a few examples to share. We helped to employ 900 persons with disabilities in Walmart during 18 months. And as we looked at the results of this inclusion, one of the biggest concerns in retail is turnover. So in Brazil, it's around 40% of annual turnover. And with persons with disabilities, we had less than half of the turnover rate that they were used to. So Walmart did the math to understand how much they were saving by having these great employees that were staying longer and were delivering the same or better results. They also put on that math how much they would have to pay as a fine for the quota. So Walmart was saving $10 million per year with their inclusion project that we helped them to build. So we're talking about shifting the culture of the company, having better results, and at the end of the day, also financial results that we can show.
Super. Sounds like you should just charge them 10% of their cost savings. That would be an interesting invoice. All right, thank you very much, Gru. I want to move on now to Gabriel. If we could just see Gabriel's brand there for us for a second. So Gabriel, I'm going to ask you the same question, really. Who's your most important customer with Incluyam? The employer or the individual?
We cannot think about one public without the other. I mean, it's a community and we need to work in both sides. And during this journey of running Incluyam, we discovered a gap between the skills that companies are looking for and the skills that sometimes people with disabilities are having. And sometimes they are not aware of the skills actually needed to get a job. And we decided to start changing this reality by providing trainings for students with disabilities, but those trainings were focused on the skills that the labor market is actually looking for. Last year, we trained 1,600 people with disabilities in tech. Those trainings were focused on helping people to become software developers, software testers, graphic designers, and all the type of jobs that people can do remotely, only needed for a computer and a connection with internet, so they can offer their services to a global labor market. And the goal there is to remove barriers. In Latin America, we're having a lot of accessibility barriers in the region, and the goal there is try to overcome those barriers by giving the right skills to the right people so they can earn an income while doing that. And we also, I fully agree with what Guy said, because we also need to work with companies and trying to enable a more inclusive culture. And with that, it means that we need to run a diagnosis, understanding where the company is, if they are having inclusive leaders or not, how aware they are about what a disability is and what's not, what is a reasonable accommodation, which are the costs involved, because sometimes there are like ghosts saying, hey, this is going to cost me a lot, but when you actually put this into a budget, the cost is near to zero. And with all these steps in place, then we can make this inclusion happen. I mean, we can connect the talent of people with disabilities with companies, and then we are going to have inclusion that lasts, not only have a few inclusions and that's it.
Well, actually, you raised this question of cost. There's a widespread assumption, and I include across the NGO community, that accommodations or adjustments, whatever we call them, are expensive. So if an employer working with you needed to, for example, bring in an interpreter for someone who is deaf, who pays for the accommodations that do tend to be more costly? For example, new computers, perhaps, or sophisticated technology. Do you pay? Does the employer pay? Is there a government service? How's it covered?
It depends on the country. Sometimes there are the country is paying for this, but this is not being known sometimes. And in other cases, we discover that an interpreter is only needed in a particular spot times, but the person can easily read lips or using the subtitles or the closed caption that technology tools are having. That's enough for most of the deaf community. So we need to understand on a case-by-case basis if interpreters are needed or not. In the case they are needed, there are a lot of, in this case, depending on the country, but there is a lot of support from governments to provide to overcome the costs associated with this. And in other cases, in the case where the company needs to pay for the interpretation, the costs are really cheap. I mean, I don't want to put a price tag on this, but those are not expensive services. I mean,
they're not expensive by a corporate's way of looking at
corporate
things.
standard is,
Usually.
I mean, they are paying more money in really trivial things, and is the cost, the average cost of having a full interpreter working for a company in one country is the equivalent of having coffee capsules for one only part of the office for 4 days. So this is not a barrier.
That's interesting. All right. Well, I'd also like to get a better sense of the kind of services you offer to employers. How many companies are you working with? And do they just put a vacancy up and then hope that a person applies? I mean, or do you actually help them as they're preparing to advertise their vacancies?
We are nowadays working with 500 employers, and the realities for those employers are really different between each other. Sometimes we are having employers that are only looking for talent, and then they are on a stage that they're saying, hey, I'm only posting job vacancies here, and I'm expecting to receive a lot of job applicants with disabilities. So they are also aware on how to conduct interviews for people with disabilities. They are I would say, in the late stage of inclusion. And the way we work with companies is, first of all, understanding where they are, then creating a plan together. I mean, saying, hey, which are the outcomes that you expect, and just start using some indicators to say, okay, what success looks like in 12 months and what's not. So we can work together to have the right metrics in place and also to achieve inclusion. And the goal there is not only working on or staying on employment. For us, inclusion is a broader space. And we have examples of, for example, a beauty company that managed to start from scratch 2 years ago. And nowadays, they are not only hiring, but they are working to make the value chain more inclusive. They are also creating products that address the needs of all people, not only people without disabilities. And they are also running marketing campaigns that are displaying models with disabilities. So this is social inclusion as well of people with disabilities. So this is for us the goal.
That's brilliant. I think there's two things there for me. One is there's a tendency on the part of governments and NGOs and so on to just generalize about employers, about business. Actually, I often think we don't want to generalize about people with disabilities, but we seem to generalize about people working in the private sector, when, as you've said, they're so very different plans for different organizations depending where they are. And I think too, the more we start talking business and the advantages of responding to the needs of disabled customers, we get a much, much more sophisticated conversation with the average company.
Sure.
Wolfgang, we're going to move now to Europe. Can I see Wolfgang's logo up here with myAbility? Wolfgang is the co-founder and MD. And so Wolfgang, is there anything terribly different about the way your operation works in Europe and your two colleagues from Latin America? What strikes you? You know, my question, who's the most important customer, business or people with disabilities? Is that relevant, or are you just going to say exactly the same thing?
First of all, thank you for being part of this, and thank you, Susan, for this great moderation. And yeah, no, there's nothing more to say. It's all said. No, but what I can confirm is it's very similar situation. It doesn't matter where you guys work. We face the same challenges and maybe the same even trends, and maybe also potentials that are now on the table. And if you ask me what is more important, I would answer it the same way, but with different words. I would call it like this, that we think there is, of course, the first thought on people with disabilities, because our mission of myAbility is to create a fair and accessible society, and maybe even help to lower the unemployment rate and all this. That's why we do it. So the first thought is maybe that, but nothing without the openness and the readiness and the professionalism of companies. So we need to focus on the companies in order to bring these two groups together in a better way. That's how I would describe it. And I think there's many associations and there's a lot of funding that tries to help people with disabilities directly to get jobs, but there's much less to do so with companies. And that's why our maybe focus or our field of operation is very close to how can we improve the ways into the company, how can we open or develop company cultures and all similar things that Gabriel and Pete told you before.
You say culture. I mean, I used to joke about how the word culture made me reach for my gun because it was so difficult to define. Can you just give us some practical examples of the service or the training or what you offer to the companies in the German-speaking region? And perhaps you could talk a little bit about the intern program, the what do you call it? Forgive me, I can't remember what it's called.
Talent program, we call it.
A talent program. So yeah, that's a distinctly new offering to companies in your region. What's that all about?
Yeah, if I first start with this culture thing, and I completely agree, it's used very often and it's easy to use, because it tells it all, but it's difficult to break it down and to measure and to see the progress there. Maybe one example is like yesterday I received an email from a big bank in Switzerland, where one of our co-managers of myAbility held a keynote speech 2 days ago, a very emotional one, of a person who has a disability herself, and there were, I think, altogether hundreds of people listening. And this diversity manager sent an email to us saying she could sleep better now because there was one employee approaching her that after 20 years working for the bank, it was the first time that I could be open with my disability. Like these kind of things. And when these things happen very often or automatically, or how you call it, I don't know, then you can talk about an open culture. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do. Not only this, but this is maybe a good example for that. So that people that are already within the company are ready to share their needs, their experience, and maybe their thoughts about the future job. And of course, also when you hire people, that it's maybe a good moment for the job interviewer and the candidate to talk about it before you design the job or before you decide who to hire. So this can be maybe a visible spot where you see if it's in our terms an open culture or not. And that's what we're also trying to do with our talent program. Like, what, in very simple words, it's a matching program of corporates and students or young academics with disabilities and chronic diseases. We are running it in 7 or 8 locations already in a German-speaking area. I think it's six spots in Germany, 1 in Vienna, 1 in Switzerland. And the idea is everywhere the same, that we think it's important either first to tell companies, are you interested in talented young people for your staff in the future? They all say yes, of course. And then the second part is, what about doing it with people with disabilities? And then they say, it sounds interesting. And first they say, okay, it's a good investment because we can cover our hiring needs. And second, it's this learning process at this, it's a bit of a hidden agenda, no? That during getting to know people with disabilities and telling them about the jobs and vice versa, you learn a lot. And in some cases already there have been groups of people saying, I volunteer now, we would like to join forces and do it more often, or let's start a networking group for this idea and things like that. So this is also in many cases a good starting point to talk about culture.
When you say networking group, do you mean business to business, or do you mean disabled employee networks?
Even employee network, even that when you first see who is interested and who takes part in this program, who volunteers to take part in the program, you automatically have a group of people that is interested and open. So this is where sometimes these networks arise.
I think that's interesting, because as we look at the way funders approach economic empowerment, the assumption is always that we're talking about unemployed people with disabilities. We're rarely talking about the 10 to 12% of any large workforce that will have a disability, even if they haven't taken on that identity with their employer. And they certainly rarely talk about people who become disabled while in work, which is where these disabled employee networks can play such a role.
Yeah.
Well, I reckon we've got about 4 or 5 minutes, if I'm correct here. So I had the chance to ask you all, because of the audience, don't forget, we're talking at Zero Project to one of the world's biggest networks of NGOs, disabled people's organizations, organizations of people with disabilities, governments, key players who have a great interest in this issue and are constantly looking for better ways to do things. So if you were the king of your region, if you were able to do whatever you wanted, magic wand, who needs to do what differently to transform this, to get 100 times more disabled people into jobs in any given year, hundreds of times more? So many of the programs I look at, they get 10 or 20 people into work. What if we were talking thousands? Who needs to do what differently? Who wants to start? Gabriel.
I was afraid of that.
Okay.
Well, I don't. Why, you're just in the middle as I look at my screen.
A great power means a great responsibility as well, right? So that's Spider-Man. I think that the beginning of all starts with education. Education, I mean, in the general society, about looking to, first of all, remove barriers, and then learn to look the person, not only the disability. And when you are considering the person, you have the moral obligation to attend the rights of that person. And it means that, in my region at least, that students with disabilities can actually attend classes. They can also receive a diploma, and they are subjects of rights and obligations, not subjects of charity. And it's the general society that needs to shift their vision about what a disability means and what's not. We are used to see people with disabilities begging for money in the corners of the streets. Yesterday, I saw a person who were holding a QR code here saying, hey, I'm also accepting donations or money with your cell phone. So that's the evolution of begging for money,
Begging.
I would say.
Hmm.
So, and this person was having, I would say, a disability that was absolutely compatible with, I would say, most of the jobs that the society can offer. So, first of all, we need to work with the community of people with disabilities and just start looking for the possibilities and not looking for what's missing. And then with the rest of the society, saying, hey, we are having a 10 to 15% of the population with a disability that are in need of more opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. Gui, what's your magic wand want to make happen?
We created a concept here called human accessibility. And this was a different way of talking about culture. It's basically preparing people to understand and really connect and be in relation with the person with disability. This is usually the biggest problem. People don't relate because they're not used to, and only a few people who have someone in the family or has a disability is the one who look for that. So employment of persons with disabilities is a complex problem. So here in Brazil, we have accessibility problems, transportation, education. So there's tons of things that we would have to do. But I would definitely start on exactly what Gabriel said, how the society look for a person with disability. So whenever we start to really understand the potential that is being wasted in most of the countries of not having a person with disability working, we can start to shift. And by making everyone really understanding this process and shifting the culture and how our society looks, then I believe we're going to start to bring priority to these problems. Because as Gabriel mentioned, I love the coffee capsules example. It's not money the problem, it's priority. It's really understanding the importance of the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the labor market.
Thank you. And you, sir, in Vienna.
Thank you that I had some minutes to think about my answer. I hope it makes sense what I'm saying, but in my case, in Vienna, the emperor or the king was very powerful. And I think I would use this power to make strict laws to reinforce accessibility. Because many people talk about, let's not talk about barriers in your heads anymore, let's break these barriers. Let's not only talk about it. And maybe this is a way, an additional way, not the only one, to say high fines if your products or if infrastructure, if language whatsoever is not accessible. And this way, I'd like to drive this society towards a society where everyone can participate. It would be a bit like a wonderland, but I think this way of thinking would be helpful also now when you make laws that work and are not ignored. And maybe a second one, I would also set up an advisory board with Guy, Gabriel and Wolfgang, because social entrepreneurs have great and innovative ideas to drive change and drive inclusion.
All right, as long as I don't have to chair it, we're all right. So what I would add, what I would add before we close, as I listened to you, there were three things going through my head. One is, I think it was Gui mentioned the power of the face-to-face, human-to-human contact. And for me, the strategy wouldn't be, if I was the queen, to find a way to systematically bring business leaders and leaders with disabilities together to learn from and with each other. All kinds of ways are open to us there. I think secondly, I was really pleased we call this re-engineering labor markets, is we'd be saying to NGOs and to government funders and others, stop just doing little projects that get a few people into work almost against the odds, and start to look at how we bring people with disabilities into mainstream talent pipelines routinely so that it becomes much easier for employers to always find candidates with the right skills when they need them. And that for me means the funders, if you're listening, funders must insist when they fund say digital training programs, that they are welcoming and skilled at also serving people with disabilities, rather than as they do now, assuming employers are supposed to make adjustments, but not the training providers who should be providing employers with the candidates, which is a little curious. And I suppose the overarching message from all of you is that the society of ours, the bigger society of ours, needs to understand disability is to do with human rights, employment rights, talent. It's a word not heard often enough in these debates, and that we have to understand that the employers do not go home and get beaten up by their families because they are not getting it on disability. They're surrounded by people, their families and friends and all around them who share their misapprehensions that actually people with disabilities are more about being a problem than the talent if we were clever. So I guess we've got a fair bit of work to do. But thank you very much, all of you. I'm really grateful for all the time you've spent putting this alliance together, the sharing of the learning and keeping each other motivated to keep on with this. Much appreciated. And of course, we'll be saying to anyone in the audience, do get in touch with any of us if you have any questions. Thank you very much, and hope we're having a wonderful Zero Project conference. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.